Yeah, good morning and welcome everyone to this year's first New South Wales Dairy Breakfast for April. For those that don't know me, my name's Zita Ritchie. I'm a Program Manager Dairy based on the Far North Coast in New South Wales at Wollongbar, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. But before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we've got an hour for today's session, and yeah, generally like to keep things to time. So we've got two parts of today's session. First of all, the main part of today is we've got a presentation by Simmons. So Aaron joins us from the DPI climate branch and is really well versed on the carbon and emission space and also how it relates to the dairy industry. So it's great to have Aaron with us today to give us a bit of an overview of some of the key things for the dairy industry. And look, it's a big topic and we know that we can't cover off everything in a lot of detail, but it'll be great to just give an overview and we'll have time for questions at the end. So if I can please ask to wait for your questions at the end, but please feel free to write questions in the chat as we're going and we'll try and address those first, or we can, or raise your hand at the end of the session. And then after that, I'll have about 5 minutes or so just to give an overview of the storm and flood industry recovery program that we've kind of kicked off for the dairy industry in New South Wales and give a bit more of information about those projects in that larger program. But I think that really just starts for today. But if I can ask that everyone stays on mute when they're not talking, that'd be great. And look, Aaron, I'll hand it over to you, but unless there's anything else, but thanks very much for joining us today.
Okay, you can hear me all right, Zita?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, it's working now. So I'm a senior research scientist in the climate branch with New South Wales DPI based at Taree. My role is looking at emissions reductions in our ag systems and also doing some policy work about developing policies and whatnot to assist in looking at what those emissions reductions might be and how to implement them across different industries. The overview of what I'm going to do today, it's going to be quite high level, but I'll give a global context of what's happening in the space of climate change, discuss some of the drivers of change, why change is happening. I'll give a brief overview of what the greenhouse gas emissions from dairy production are and where they come from, some of the abatement opportunities for greenhouse gas emissions that are currently available and some that will be coming online that I'm confident about. Carbon credits. Do you actually need them? It depends on what you want to achieve. The things that you can do now might not actually be reducing your emissions, but what, if you want to be proactive about it, what you can do, and also what's next. What's the next big thing on the government's radar in particular? So if you look at what's happening at a global, around the globe, we have the Paris Agreement, which is the IPCC, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above, I can't remember actually, I've had a mental blank. Anyway, so to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, so that is this keeps flicking up. So that's something that most countries have signed on to. It was the Kyoto Protocol, we've now got the Paris Agreement, and Australia's actually submitted its first emissions results to the UNFCCC for the Paris Agreement. So that's one of the key drivers, is just limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. People would have also heard about net zero targets. So basically, there's going to be emissions associated with whatever we do, but we need to also offset those emissions. And when you look at that at a global scale, this gives you an idea of the countries actually have net zero targets. So anything that isn't grey, anything that's green, dark green, or a browny colour actually has some kind of net zero target in place. So the colour of the shading dictates whether it's a 2030, 2050, what they're looking for and how they're going to do it. But essentially, when you look at it, most or a good proportion of countries have a net zero target, and it actually covers about 90% of the global population has a net zero target. So to work towards having no greenhouse gas emissions, effectively, no net greenhouse gas emissions. Then we also have the Global Methane Pledge, which people would have heard. And so that's to reduce global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So I guess one of the key things is that, methane is quite potent as a greenhouse gas, but it's short-lived. And so really, when you look at what needs to be done for methane, we don't need to stop all methane emissions to actually to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but we do need to have a reduction in methane emissions. So they're the things and the policies and whatnot that are happening at a global level. But what's actually driving change more is looking more at a domestic level, I suppose. So one of the key ones, or the key one that I see happening at the moment, is market access. So when you look at things like these targets here are Fonterra's targets that they have set in Australia around their emissions. So clearly, if they've set these targets, they don't want to be sourcing milk from producers that, you know, have high emissions intensity, because that's going to make it difficult for them to reach their targets. Coles carbon neutral beef is another one that's currently running. So if you want to provide beef to Coles carbon neutral label, you need to have low emissions beef. They actually measure your emissions, and they only take people with the lowest emissions because they need to buy credits to offset that, so they've got carbon neutral beef. So that's a clear signal of how things may work in the future. And then the EU PEF is the European Union's product environmental footprint. And basically anything that gets sold in the EU will have a little label on it, and it'll give you the environmental footprint of that. So that'll be the water footprint, the carbon footprint. So the idea is that consumers will be able to selectively purchase things that have a low footprint. And so a lot of this is around consumers and driving that, and, you know, supply chains picking up on that sentiment. There's also risk assessment. So we've got this thing called the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Now, essentially what they're doing there, they've set up a framework so that investors can look at companies on the stock market, and they can see how exposed they are to climate-related risks. And they're putting this framework together. So essentially, if somebody goes, well, I want to have something that's not going to be exposed to climate-related risks, whether that's the extremes of climate change or whether it's because they're exacerbating climate change, but it's going to be something, and there's quite a few companies that have taken that up. So there's this driver for investors to minimise their risk associated with climate change as well. So of course, any company that's a publicly listed company is going to want to make sure that they're providing the information and they're minimising that climate risk. And one of the ways of doing that is either not having exposure to businesses that will be, or minimising the risk of their business that will be affected by climate change, but also reducing their emissions. And then the final one, which I've already alluded to, is consumers, the social licence to operate. You know, so the National Farmers Federation set a pretty robust target, and, you know, people were kind of surprised but pleased with that. But then consumers are now pushing for greater action. And this relates to the labelling, you know, the carbon footprint labelling. So consumers will selectively purchase things that are low emissions because they want to do something about that. And so that's a big driver for processors as well, to make sure that when they label their products, they're going to have products that are low emissions that consumers want to buy. And this final thing here, goal 10, reduce greenhouse gas emissions intensity. That is actually Dairy Australia's target. So they want to see a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 across the whole industry from a baseline of 2015. So we have this pressure coming from everywhere to actually reduce our emissions intensity and have low emissions products. It's coming from investors, it's coming from consumers, and it's driven by high level global policy initiatives. So I guess one of the things is, you know, where do the emissions come from in a dairy system? So this is one, gives you an idea of where you're going to have the biggest bang for your buck in reducing emissions in a dairy system. So here, on average, and this is from 2014, but I've done recent work that gives a similar number for New South Wales. So, you know, it's about 1.1 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is just putting all greenhouse gases on the same level when you do an emissions assessment per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. And so that's actually quite good on a global scale. So we're already good on a global scale, but Australian consumers are going to want to see that drop, because when you look at milk alternatives, they can actually be lower. Where you look at where that actually comes from, most of it comes from enteric fermentation. So when cattle eat their feed, they then digest it through their stomachs, and during that process, they're burping out methane. And so that is where about half of the greenhouse gas emissions from dairy production come from. Then we also have emissions that come from manure that's deposited on the paddock when they're grazing. There's emissions associated with the feed that's fed, so the daily ration that's fed to them. Fertilizers also produce emissions. Energy, dairies are quite energy intensive with their cooling requirements for milk and whatnot. And then also manure that's deposited in the dairy and gets put into the effluent pond is also an emission source. But these are all really quite low compared to the emissions associated with an enteric fermentation. So that tells us biggest bang for our buck is going to come from reducing this enteric fermentation, these enteric fermentation emissions. How long have I been going for? So greenhouse gas abatement strategies. One of the key things that you need to consider is, what do you want to do? Do you want to lower your emissions intensity with your product? So you want to get your milk from 1.1 kilograms of carbon dioxide to 0.8, or do you want to have a carbon neutral farm? Because what you actually do, or what your objective is, will depend on what you do. And that's driven a lot by the type of reductions that you implement. So you can have two types of emissions reductions. You can have avoided emissions. And so that's something like if you feed an enteric methane reduction supplement to your cattle and they don't put out as much methane while they're digesting their food, that's an avoided emission. Sequestration is something like planting trees, where you're actually sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere, or trying to increase your soil carbon, which is sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. And this is critical because avoided emissions, once you avoid an emission, you never have to worry about it again because it was never emitted to the atmosphere. So that's gone. You just bank that, never have to worry about it again. Sequestration, on the other hand, you do have to worry about. So you can plant a heap of trees, but what happens if a fire goes through that and emits the carbon back to the atmosphere? So there's a bit of risk around sequestration, not so much risk about avoided emissions. And really, when you look at when they're talking about carbon neutrality in particular, the first step is to avoid your emissions. Then you do sequestration within your business. And if you need to, then you go out and you buy offsets. So where people are going out and just buying all offsets and saying I'm carbon neutral, that's not considered best practice. So some of the potential abatement strategies, manure management. So the methane that's emitted from effluent ponds. So one of the ways you can handle this is you can actually put a covering over that, capture the methane and flame and burn it. So you can reduce emissions that way. You can also use that to produce electricity and hot water. Another one that's recently come out is actually a nitrogenous fertilizer. I can't remember what it is, but if you put that in there, it basically shuts down the manure management. So it's not a commonly used fertilizer, and I can't get a price on it, but it's about 15 kilograms of this fertilizer a day for, I think it was 100 head. So it's not a lot, but if we can get a methodology around that, I think there's a lot of potential there. Reduced enteric methane. So as I said, you can feed supplements. So one that people would have heard about would be Asparagopsis, the red seaweed. We've got 3-Nop, which is another one that's currently on the market. 1.5 cents per litre of milk produced is what it'll cost, which is a bit high at the moment. But there's actually something that can be fed to cattle right now that's going to reduce the enteric methane and reduce the emissions intensity of the milk. And there'll be others that come online. There are others, but none as effective as Asparagopsis and 3-Nop appear to be. When you put your urea on a paddock, you get nitrous oxide, N2O, from that fertilizer use. So there are actual coatings and stuff like that you can put on the fertiliser that will reduce the nitrous oxide from those fertilisers. So that will reduce your footprint, but that's only a relatively small proportion of the emissions associated with the dairy production. Renewable energy, solar panels, those kind of things, or energy efficiency. That's another way to reduce it. Now, biochar is a little bit left field, but really if you get the manure out of your pond and you heat it in an atmosphere that doesn't have oxygen, it will turn into charcoal, and you're locking up that carbon, and you can put that back on your paddocks. That'll buffer your soils against pH change. You get better, water retention. There's a whole heap of benefits around it. So that's something that would be nice to see, but it wouldn't be economically viable on farm at the moment. We'll see what happens over time. Vegetation, so you're sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. That's one, and it's commonly being used, not necessarily in dairies, but people are getting credits for it at the moment throughout Australia under various emissions technologies. And soil organic carbon, so sequestering soil organic carbon. So it's those last two that are the sequestrations. The ones that are above that are your avoided emissions. So they're good. You're not having those emissions. You don't have to think about them again. Vegetation, soil organic carbon, you could be creating a future debt for yourself that you have to pay. So I'm just going to go through quickly some results from research that we've done to show that actually soil organic carbon is risky, because there's a lot of people out there talking about soil organic carbon and how you can make a lot of money from it and, all this other stuff. Here we have our soil organic carbon stocks in the top 30 centimetres of the soil. This is out at Canoundra. These are mixed farming systems. We sampled the soil in 2012, 2017 and 2022. So we went back to the same paddocks, did it rigorously, and you can see here that most sites went up in the first 5 years and 8 out of 10 sites in the second 5 years went back down, some to a point that was lower than where they started. So if you claimed in that first 5 years, if you claimed that on your emissions intensity, in that next 5 years, you're adding that to your emissions intensity. So you've basically generating a debt by doing it that needs to be repaid. So it's very risky. And in particular, if you're thinking about trading soil carbon, then you would have gotten credits for this. But if this reversal here, this down reversal doesn't go back up, you might have to actually pay those credits back at the end of what's called the permanency period, because you've lost that soil carbon. Now, if you got $30 for your credits that you sold there, and in another 15 years, carbon credits are $200, you've potentially generating a big debt for yourself. So this is recent field data, and that's just another one from another research site that we did that showed the same thing, where the carbon went up and then it dropped.
Aaron?
Yes.
Aaron, just a quick question, go back to that last slide. Was there a farming practice that, I can see this has happened and it concerns me over soil carbon, but was there a farming practice that increased it to 17, and what did he do? What happened between 17 and 22 to end up back as a deficit?
So there was no most of these were cropping sites that made a change and went to pasture or did something to their cropping system that had an increase. And between that, they did not change anything. This is mostly going to be a climate signal. We need to tease it out. I need to get more data and we need to do some analysis. But we need to tease out what actually happened here. But I can definitely say they didn't have permanent pastures, which they then flogged the snot out of with a plough. I actually sampled these sites, and one of these sites that went down had some of the best pastures that I've ever seen, kind of rolling around in the clover with the lambs kind of pastures. So it is the effect of climate. So management can change the soil carbon, but climate is the overall driver, and this would be the climate signal.
So you are continuing the sampling? Is that the plan on the same farm or farms?
Well, if we can get funding in 5 years' time, we'll go back and see what happens for sure.
I'd like to see, like, if there's a climate, if you're indicating that, I'd just love to see what is this going to continue to, is it going to continue to decline, or will it potentially do a reverse?
Yeah, we don't know, but we're going to be running models across this to see if we can tease that out and figure out what happened. And there's a whole heap of work that needs to be done. But the key message out of this is that just because you increase your soil carbon doesn't mean that it's going to stay there. You can lose it. And so that was 10 sites around Canowindra, and these were sites out around Condobolin where the same thing happened. So it's about the risk. So carbon credits, there is a lot of talk about carbon credits and the money that you can make from carbon credits. But what you need to think about is whether you actually need them, okay? Because it depends on your objective. If you want low emissions intensity for market access, so let's say you want to get carbon neutral beef because you're growing out heifers or whatever, and you want to try and get carbon neutral beef, you don't need carbon credits. You just need a robust way to measure your emissions and show that you've got a low emissions intensity. If you want to sell your credits for income, then you need credits. You need to go through the hassle of actually doing everything so you can generate those credits and then sell them on the market. But the critical thing is you cannot double count your credits. You cannot say, I've got low emissions intensity milk, and then you go and sell all your credits to somebody else, which then get counted again, which is double counting. If you reduce your emissions intensity, generate credits and sell them, you've got full emissions intensity milk still, which then may limit your market access. You can't do both. So you just really need to think about what your objective is, okay, before you go down this kind of path. So then if somebody comes knocking on the door and wants to sell you carbon credits, there are some relevant questions you need to ask. So where is the evidence that abatement's actually going to occur? So if somebody comes to you and says, you're going to increase your soil carbon by 2%, and over the next 25 years, you're going to make $3 million, you need to say, how do you know I actually have the capacity to increase my soil organic carbon by 2%? Because on the milking country, where people are sitting there and they've got really good nutrition, really high productivity, you're probably not going to see an increase in soil organic carbon. You would already have really high soil organic carbon because it's extremely productive and there's no nutrient limitations and that kind of thing. So if they're trying to tell you you're going to get an increase, you're not, you know. So you need to see where the evidence is to support any claims that they make. Otherwise, they're just talking crap. If they can't provide that, then just, you know, really have a good hard think. What are the upfront costs to me? So I've just shown that soil carbon can go down. You know, I've seen quotes for $250,000 to baseline people's places for soil carbon. Now, if they don't have an increase or it goes down, they're not going to get any credits that's actually going to offset that cost. And they would need to sample again to do that. So that'd be $500,000 where they may not actually get anything. So what are the upfront costs to me? Because whenever you go for credits, there's always a scheme that you have to be involved in, and there's compliance and everything else. So they might want to take a certain portion of the credits. You may have to pay up front, and then they take 20% or 40% of the credits that you generate as well. So there's going to be costs associated with this, and they're not easy to be in. So it actually makes sense to get somebody to do that, but you need to know what the upfront costs are and what risks that actually poses to your business. And I've kind of spoken about that, but you know, risks are, well, what are the risks associated with if I plant trees and a fire goes through, how is that handled? Do I have a carbon debt that I need to repay? What's going to go on here? So there's multiple risks around getting carbon credits, and you need to understand that, and they need to be open. If somebody says there's no risks, they're not really, you know, being open with you. And then the Carbon Market Institute, which is an Australian organisation, has a code of conduct. Now, I was convinced that this was a relatively good thing, but then I saw a report recently by somebody that was aligned with the code of conduct, and it really wasn't robust. So I don't know how good that is. I've left it in there because it's something that's in there, but you need to take pause. If they've signed up to the code of conduct, they're probably going to be more robust, but it doesn't mean that it's, you know, a certification that means that there's not going to be anything wrong with what they're doing or what they're saying. So what you can do now, one of the key things you can do now is actually understand what your emissions are and where they're coming from. So I showed earlier on where the emissions come from in a dairy system. That was across all of Australia. So each system is going to differ depending on things like how much fertilizer they use, the proportion of milking area to hilly country that they're growing out heifers, or whether they've got a beef component on the side and that kind of thing. And there's calculators out there that'll help you do that. So you've got the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator that's available, and that's specific to dairy systems. And then recently the MLA released their carbon calculator. Now I've been diving into this MLA carbon calculator over the last couple of days, and I can say it's excellent. It is absolutely fantastic with how it works. It is easy to use. It does a really good job, and it's quite intuitive. So there is a time, there's a time component to it. But if you've got a beef component to your operation, then the MLA carbon calculator is going to be a really good way to do that. The Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator I haven't actually dug into. There's another one that's similar to this that I have, but I would say it's not as intuitive as the MLA carbon calculator. But that's one way of actually getting the footprint of your milk out of your system, is by using that dairy carbon calculator. What is critical is you need to understand the data needs. What data do I actually need so that I can calculate my carbon footprint? Because it can be extensive. So for the MLA carbon, or even the dairy calculator, you're going to need to know the weight of your cattle, and you're going to need to know how much fertilizer you used. You're going to need to know how much diesel you use, how much electricity you use. There's all these things that need to be included, but one of the ways is to participate in Dairy Base, because that's all the information that goes into Dairy Base. And in Dairy Base, if you answer another 6 questions, I think it is, then it'll actually give you your carbon footprint. So if you're already a Dairy Base member, then pretty much all the information that you need to get a carbon footprint is in there, and it will give you a carbon footprint of your milk as it currently stands. So Dairy Base is probably a good way to go, because you're also getting the economics associated with your enterprise under Dairy Base, which then aligns with your carbon footprint as well. So that'd probably be a good path to go down if people are interested in doing that. One of the key things is to maintain the productivity focus. I mean, I know how productive dairy systems are, and I know how efficient they are. So to try and find additional efficiencies would be quite difficult within a dairy system as they currently stand. But basically, if you can somehow get more milk while all things remain the same, or you can produce the same amount of milk by having some efficiencies, by using less energy, by somehow using less nitrogen. So, if somebody's putting on a bit more urea just because it's relatively cheap. So, well, actually the price has come down. So I will say relatively cheap, but it might be insurance to put on an extra 50 kilos of urea just to make sure, well, if you drop that 50 kilos because your soil tests say you don't need it, well, then there's an efficiency which shouldn't harm your milk production, that kind of thing. But the key thing is to maintain your productivity focus. The more productive you are, the more that you can get out of your area that you farm, while actually being judicious with your inputs, the lower your emissions intensity is probably the best way to look at it. Importantly, if you do want to go down that path of generating credits to sell, if there's an existing methodology to generate those credits, then go ahead, go for it, participate in it, But the key thing is if there is no existing methodology, don't touch it, because there are things around what are called newness requirements and additionality, which would exclude you from participating in a credit market. So if you went over and planted, you've got a hilly block and you plant out 100 acres of trees, you can't go and then try and generate credits from those in 5 years' time. You need to actually set up a scheme and participate in the scheme before you go and make an investment decision around planting those trees. If you want to reduce your emissions intensity, go and plant them, doesn't matter. Because in 5 years' time, the carbon that's sequestered will be coming off your footprint when you do it. But you just need to make sure that if somebody's selling you something that's going to reduce your emissions and you want to generate credits to sell, that you don't start doing it until you've signed up to a program that's going to generate those credits. This is the second last slide and I can't see the top of it. So I'll let Zita, are you there, Zita? Do you want to talk to this one?
Yeah, we can see the slide. It's just to let everyone know that if you want some additional information, just recently Dairy Australia have released some climate online learning modules, which are there for service providers or farmers. There's 3 modules, so it's split into climate risk for dairy, which is kind of more talking about climate and weather and some of the trends and things that we've been observing and managing risk. And then what are they at, like adapting to climate change. But then thirdly, covers off on a lot of what Aaron's discussed today and a little bit more data around dairy greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, what are the key areas that you can focus on to reduce that emissions intensity on farm? Kind of understanding what are the sources of emissions and yeah, so it covers a bit more of that in more detail. So if you know farmers or other service providers that kind of want to upskill a little bit more in this area, you can access that through NLIGHT. So they've just been released about a month ago. So just an additional resource there. But yeah, thanks, Aaron.
Okay, thanks, Zita. So what's next? There's clear signals from the federal government in particular that the focus will be on biodiversity. And I think that's actually going to be a lot easier to deal with than carbon has been. So, you know, if you're thinking forward and what's going to come, biodiversity is going to be the next thing. And that's a lot of that will be probably about making sure that, you know, you've got corridors of trees linking any remnant veg, you've got those kind of things. And I don't think it'll be anywhere near as arduous as carbon. And we're already seeing some stuff coming through from the markets where, you know, high biodiversity agricultural products and that kind of thing to meet consumer demands for those kind of things. So just have that on your radar. The final thing I'll say, this QR code that I've got here, it's a bit of a plug for another New South Wales DPI project. There's the on-farm carbon advice project that DPI is currently running. And essentially what that's doing is it's going to step producers through the process of estimating the emissions associated with their current production, and it'll develop a bit of a template around that. It'll also then look at current strategies to reduce their emissions intensity or reduce their total emissions, and come up with some plans about, you know, some approaches that they can use to do that. So this is being recorded. I assume everybody will get a recording of it, but if anybody is actually interested in, participating in that, click on the QR code and put in an expression of interest. And I'm not 100% sure what happens after that expression of interest is submitted. But at least, you know, the more people out there, particularly if there's one region where there's a lot of expressions of interest, the more likely they are to set up some workshops so that people can start going down this path if they're interested. And I will wrap it up there, Zita. I think that's 31 minutes.
Great, perfect. Thanks, Aaron. That's perfect timing. So feel free to write more questions in the chat. We've got one here already. So Mel Bayliss down in Begas, she's just mentioned there's a company called Carbon Pump that is signing up farmers to sell their carbon on a 12-month contract. Their selling point is no risk. It appears they're double counting. Who regulates this? Do you have any comments on that, Aaron? I mean, Ken's also written a bit of a response there that these are financial products, so come under some regulatory control like other financial products, but I don't know with your experience, Aaron, if you've got any comments around that.
Am I sharing my screen still?
You are, yeah, so you can stop sharing.
How do I stop it? Here we go, stop share.
Yeah, perfect.
Hey, there we go. Sorry, say that again, Carbon Pump. I'd have to look into Carbon Pump.
Mel, feel free to ask the question direct if you like. If you're still online. Maybe she's not.
Yeah, I'm still online,
yeah.
Zita. This is a, yeah, they've got a website. It's very flash, but what they're saying to farmers is they'll come out and monitor your carbon and then you sell it on a 12-month contract. Someone buys it and then the next year you can sell it again. So if your carbon goes down, it just means you've got less to sell that in that next year. So it's it's got a lot of people very excited that they can actually be carbon farmers rather than actually worry about dairy farming at all. So, but I just can't see how it can work.
No, I can't. Look, I will go and have a look at this, and I might give some advice back to Zita. I don't understand how that can work.
Yeah, I know.
I've heard another mob, or I've had discussions with another group that have been talking about this, and I don't understand how if you sequester carbon, then you lose it by trading on an annual basis, you reduce your risk. I would need that explained to me to be confident in that.
The website doesn't go into any detail, of course. It just sounds very nice and sounds really good. But yeah, I haven't. It just I'm just after some tools to be able to counteract it.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. What was the other one, Zita?
Well,
the financial. Yeah. So there is something in the back of my head about financial advice and carbon farming.
It's not, according to the regulator, it's not regulated. So in terms of in terms of if you give financial advice, you have to have, have to have the accreditation.
Yeah.
According to the regulator, from what I can see, there's an exemption with regard to soil carbon, and I don't exactly understand why, but it's on the emission. It's on the Clean Energy Regulator website.
The ERF website, yeah. So there was a push to actually make, I don't understand why they didn't do it, but there was a push probably 10 years ago to make sure that it was put into the same basket. And yeah, clearly they didn't do it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that'd be good to get some more information there. Any other questions for Aaron?
Yes, it's Chris Aaron. I think when you've done a presentation before to a group up on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, something you had stuck in my mind, and it was might be a bit long-winded this, but you suggested that we actually hold our credits to ourselves, like to our own business, and don't consider selling them. Is there some mechanics that we can follow that going forward that is that happened, or is there a way of start? I'd like to start now effectively as soon as possible.
I think it comes back to, do you even need the credits? So take one step back further. So when I spoke, that was at Tim Bale's place.
That's correct.
Yeah. So when I spoke at Tim's, my thinking hadn't got to where it is now. They didn't have the carbon neutral beef thing where they'd started using this different approach. But really it comes back to, do you actually need those credits? Because, getting credits costs money. So if you don't need those credits, then you should be able to do things and just show that you've had an emissions reduction. Okay. So by calculating your footprint on that, so let's say you plant out 100 hectares of trees, for example, and each year that sequesters carbon, and it's going to sequester more carbon for about 30 years, and then it'll start tapering off. That will just bring down your footprint every 30 years. You don't need to get credits as long as you've got a robust way of estimating how much carbon those trees are sequestering each year. And you put that into the calculator, and some of the calculators do it, and then that will reduce your emissions intensity, and it'll show up in your footprint, in the footprint of your mill. So you may not even need credits to get the objective that you want to get to, basically.
Thank you.
Aaron, I have a question, Juan Garzulo from New South Wales DPI. So you showed the average emissions for the dairy industry. Yeah. Those include any sequestration or by pastures or by soil in that calculation?
No.
Are just emissions?
That was just the emissions, yeah.
Are we missing something there with those? Is it potentially lower?
Oh, look, so once again, that was quite a broad brush. That was quite a broad brush take for Australian milk. I think the thing that is missing is that each system is run differently. And so the actual emissions intensity of each system will be different. Now, some people may choose to plant trees or sequester soil carbon or whatever, which will reduce their emissions intensity. I guess the key thing is that if the key thing to take away from that might not be that number of 1.1, because that number of 1.1 is going to differ between individual enterprises just because of each person does things differently. But the relative proportion of those emissions from those different sources will, as it currently stands, unless somebody's done something, will remain consistent. Unless they've implemented one of those abatement strategies, that relative proportion from those different sources will be consistent across enterprises, relatively consistent across enterprises.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Anything else? Any other questions? Feel free to jump in. I guess, Aaron, I mean, often when we're talking about this topic, like you've mentioned, you know, dairy farms, dairy systems are already very efficient, which we know. And, you know, we've got these emerging technologies. We're understanding that methane, you know, is probably the biggest component of total emissions, but there's still, you know, at varying stages of where that could feasibly be implemented. In your opinion, what do you think, if I was a dairy farmer now wanting to reduce my overall emissions intensity and trying to maybe track that, so do a baseline and maybe look at changes, what would you, in your opinion, like where would be the easiest wins for you to start with? You know, if you would
look, you know, the easiest win, but it's just not going to be economic at the moment unless the processes start giving the financial benefit for it. The easiest win is to start feeding 3-NOP to cattle. It's got regulatory, so 3-NOP is just something that goes into the ration and that reduces their enteric methane by about 70%. But it varies greatly on the diet, but you can assume it to be about 70%. So if processors started saying, well, look, you feed 3-NOP and we'll give you 1.5 cent premium on your milk, it would be cost neutral, and they would be then getting their overall milk footprint would go down, and so would the on-farm milk footprint. I mean, dairy, when you look at these kind of things, dairy is, for want of a better word, got it easy because they get their cattle in twice a day to feed them anyway, you know, sometimes more. So if you look at extensive grazing systems in beef, it's going to be harder to implement these things. So that'd be a relatively simple thing to do, to implement by, you know, as long as the processor can get it in there and your feed gets delivered with that in there and they just go in and they just eat it twice a day, you know. So yeah, compared to extensive systems, it's simpler. There's a lot of stuff there. So anaerobic digestion is getting cheaper. It's still only viable for large dairies, I think minimum 400 cows. But if you're capturing your methane, you're burning that, you're generating heat, you're generating electricity, and that knocks off 10% of your emissions as well as reducing your energy bill. Yeah. You know, there's potential there, but again, each system's different, each person's different, each enterprise has got its own level of debt. It's, you know, the owner's got their own appetite for risk. Everybody looks at it through a completely different lens. So it's really difficult to actually give broad blanket recommendations. I think it's really on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's good, Aaron. And you know, I guess as time goes on too, we'll hopefully see more progress or around those additives and see where that kind of fits and where those incentives might be in future.
Yeah, definitely. And just hopefully they give some financial incentive for farmers to do it, basically. And once they do that, it will probably, you know, I imagine the uptake would increase. Yeah.
No, thank you. All right. Are there any other last questions before I just move on to next and then wrap up? Anyone else? Okay, great. Well, as always, thanks, Aaron. That's been an excellent presentation, really great overview. And yeah, I'm sure if there's any more questions, feel free to get in touch with myself or Aaron and we'll follow up on one of those earlier questions as well.
Always happy to engage with people and provide information one-to-one, so feel free to get in touch if you need to.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll just quickly, so before we finish today's session, look, I won't take too much time with this, but just was a good opportunity while we've kind of got a lot of service providers and a few farmers in the room today as well, is to mention the storm and flood industry recovery program. So look, this is a big program that's come about from the 2021 floods, and obviously we've had subsequent flooding in many LGAs in New South Wales since this time, but it's a big industry recovery program to help support the dairy industry. And look, it's a large program of work. It involves 3 programs. Program 1 and 2 are led by New South Wales DPI, with Program 3 being led by Dairy New South Wales. And really, Program 1 is around, supporting short-term response and recovery in the dairy industry, particularly around improving the kind of framework for better coordination and response for future events, as well as supporting, farmer emergency response on farm. Understanding there's a lot of information out there at the time of emergency response, and farmers respond in very different ways, and how we can kind of make that process more transparent and accessible for farmers during those extreme kind of emergency events. And that's myself and Tori Alexander and the New South Wales DPI team are covering off on those 2 projects in that program. And Program 2 is focused on better preparedness and lower risk and high resilience in the dairy industry. So focusing more on that kind of longer term, how we can better support the industry to future events. And it involves 4 projects, so and will be led by different parties. So the first one is around climate vulnerability assessment and risk. So we're looking at the New South Wales DPI climate branch is looking at a vulnerability assessment for the dairy industry at a statewide level out to 2050, and Blake Cheer and our team is involved with that with the DPI climate branch. As well as we'll be looking at a focus, kind of a case study farm down in the far south coast, looking at what are the adaptation options for a particular farm and a region out to 2040, and what are some of the options to better manage that risk with the future climate. Second to that, we've got risk factors and mitigation strategies, which will be led by Cybers. So really at that on-farm level, understanding what are the key risks to climate, and better prepare for future natural disasters, and kind of looking at what are the business metrics and things that a farm can use to help better manage those strategies going forward. The third is infrastructure, utilities and housing, which is led by New South Wales farmers. And it's kind of mapping the key critical infrastructure and identifying upgrades and priorities which can better support the dairy supply chain in impacted LGAs from flooding events. And then lastly, the University of Sydney is leading Project 2D there on animal feed base and resilience, around kind of the impact of natural disasters on soil, animals and feed base. And Cameron Clark is leading that project there. So we've got a number of, and Amanda Britton in the team is managing that overall program. So if you've got any questions, feel free to get in touch with her. And lastly, Program 3 is a great program with a number of components really there to support industry development for the dairy sector in New South Wales, and it's focusing on a lot of different aspects. Developing new leaders in the industry. We're understanding that workforce attraction and retention is a really big challenge for the industry. So how are we attracting new entrants, supporting new people into the industry as well as succession planning. And Project 3D, slightly different focus, but it's around looking at what are the gaps in service provision and how we can better support the service provider sector, identifying what the gaps and challenges are, and to upskill what needs are there for the service provider industry. With also Karen Romano at Dairy Australia, which Project 3E is supporting farm business feeding system. So it's around a feeding system support tool for intensive systems. So helping to kind of plan on farm investments or decisions with those new systems. And that's also coupled with an update to the environmental guidelines. So understanding that a lot of farmers are considering upgrading current infrastructure or building new dairies or different infrastructure plans on farm, how we can better improve the environmental guidelines to help navigate working with local councils and what kind of guidelines and requirements are there needed for dairy farmers. And then lastly, 3F is around promoting the ongoing value of the dairy industry in the state. So really this is around providing opportunities to promote dairy through community events, schools, programs. So if there's opportunities there in your region where there's a school or a program, please get in contact with Dairy New South Wales. Jess Bell is leading that project as well. So there's a lot of there's 12 projects across the 3 programs. It's quite a busy space, and we've just commenced this work earlier this year. So the projects are at all different I guess phases of delivery. Some are more progressed than others, but I just thought I'd mention a couple of things that are on the radar at the moment. But Program 3, a mentoring program's been kind of has started. So Carly Potts is a contact for this program, but really we've been calling for mentors and mentees. And this is not just for farmers, but across the whole supply chain. So if there's any service providers that are interested in being a mentee or farmers, so we've got a lot of mentors, excellent mentors that have registered. Applications opened earlier in the month. And actually after today's session at 10 a.m, today, there's an online information session. So if you're interested in finding out more about the mentee or mentor program, or you might know someone that's earlier in their career in farming, or earlier in wanting to upskill in this certain service provider area, and to be paired up with a mentor to find out a bit more about the program, you can scan that QR code to register. But later in May, the mentor mentees will be published and the program will be launched later in May. So an excellent program there. So yeah, feel free to think about others that might be interested. Another one that's kicked off as well with program 3 is the jobs board. So we've got 2 staff in Dairy New South Wales, Tanya and Laura, who are involved in this project. And the jobs board is now online. So it's around kind of workforce attraction and retention. And we've had 25 jobs advertised on the job board with 25 trials that have commenced. And I think 11 have been now in employment through the jobs board. So an excellent result in the last couple of months. And so please feel free to direct other farmers, or if you know of any potential employees or people interested in getting into dairy, to kind of, we can support them through that jobs board there. And then what might be coming up as well across this in different regions of the state, there's another project through program 3 looking at investment pathways and workshops, as well as interviews. We're looking for interviews of those that are looking to kind of step up into dairy, so looking to take more on a bigger role, or maybe take on a farm, or that kind of succession, or maybe those looking to step up or step back. So there'll be workshops around this, but also looking to kind of interview and potentially have a case study with people from each of those sides. So I got in touch with Carla yesterday, and she said, if you know of any farmers that are interested or kind of relevant to that kind of aspect, please get in touch with Natalie Campbell at Dairy New South Wales to register interest in participating in that program. And there will be workshops. The second one, there will be workshops. I mentioned the feeding systems support tool and also the environmental guidelines. So the tool will be kind of run out through workshops later this year across the state. So keep an eye out for that. That's really to guide in investment in intensive dairy systems. And then also we'll be having forums, 4 or 5 regional forums at different dairy regions across the state, to have direct input into what we want to see in those environmental guidelines, to kind of help guide farmers with that development pathway with those on-farm kind of investments and things like that. So really keen for some feedback on those guidelines. So we'll keep you posted about when those workshops will be held later in the year. And then always through the promoting value of the dairy industry, we're looking at reaching out for additional schools programs throughout the impacted LGAs that have been impacted by floods, as well as looking at, opportunities for more cows create career opportunities, Picasso cows, kind of promoting, the value and also what dairy brings for each of our regions. So if you're aware of any events or things that are coming up in your region, careers expos or events, let us know. At Dairy New South Wales know, and we can provide some extra support around that. So that's just kind of a couple of key things that are coming out of those programs. So feel free to get in touch with us. As I mentioned, I'm kind of managing program 1 around the short-term response and recovery, and Amanda's the contact for program 2, and Carly Potts for program 3 at Dairy New South Wales. So feel free to reach out to any of us. We also will have a website that will come out soon, which will kind of update a bit more of what's happening with the activities in each of the different projects. But apart from that, the Storm and Flood Industry Recovery Program, that'll be running till December 2024. So we've only just kind of started. So you'll be seeing a lot more activity against these projects over the next 18 months. But please reach out anytime if you've got any questions or where we might be able to add more value or how you can get involved. But apart from that, we've got our regular channels. So we've got our webpage. You can subscribe to the newsletter or our New South Wales DPI Dairy Facebook page, and then also the Business of Dairy podcast. And I don't know, Sheena or Aaron, but I think you were recording the next podcast on carbon and emissions. So that's quite timely, given we've just had the webinar that will be coming out soon. I think the 1st of May, correct me if I'm wrong there, Sheena, but feel free to join up to the podcast there and scan that QR code if you want to find out more, and send that link to other farmers or service providers that want to find out more about the topic we just discussed today. But I hope that gives you a bit of an overview of what we've got going on. And that kind of wraps up the session. Just wondering if there's, yeah, we'll be on upcoming there. Thanks, Shane. I just read that chat there. That's great. So look, thanks again, Aaron. I don't know if he's still there or if he's dropped off, but that was a really great overview. And we know that there's a lot of information in that carbon and emission space. And I think if we just continue to keep abreast of what's happening, we'd be more than happy to have future webinars on that topic too, if there was a need. So please reach out if there's any particular topics you'd like us to cover in the next breakfast. But thanks again for everyone for joining, and thanks to Aaron for your time. You've been excellent as always, and we'll see you for the next one, hopefully later in June. But thanks very much, everyone, and talk to you soon.